What we're going to start out doing today is what I've mentioned before, doing some review. And part of the reason for doing some of that review is that we really need to understand a certain part of what we had and what we've done before to be able to fully appreciate what we're going to run into in Genesis 34. Very quickly, we started out with, we started out with Jacob down here where he was born, conflict with his family, and all the way on up into Haran, where he spent 20 years in Haran with his uncle Laban. And in that 20 years time, he spent 20 years. He marries Leah and Rachel, the two sisters of his uncle Laban. He has a family of 4 sons, 4 that were born to Leah, and 4 that were born to the 2 maidservants. Each of the girls were given a maidservant. Rachel, however, is still barren. Now, this is where we're going to pick up the story. We're going to pick up the story in the middle where we find that at one time, actually near the last few years that they were in Haran, in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben, that's the oldest son of Leah, went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Give me, I pray, some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes as well?" And Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came home from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me." Leah said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. That sounds like a strange story. First of all, a little bit about the mandrakes. It was a fruit that existed in that part of the world. There's a picture of a Reuben bringing the man. The mandrake was a luscious fruit that had both aphrodisiac properties and could cause fertility. Now, both Leah and Rachel would like those. Leah wanted them so that she could spend time with her husband, who was spending all of his time with Rachel. Rachel wanted them because she wanted to have children. She was not having children. If you look at this carefully, at this point, this is Reuben, and he cannot be much more than 12 years old. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out is so much of what we're going to talk about right now deals with the age of the people at the time these things are happening. This is a little bit about the mandrake. And here's what I've already mentioned about the mandrake. So Jacob goes and spends the night with Leah. And God hearkened to Leah, and she conceived and bore a 5th son. Leah said, "God has given me my hire because I gave my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore a 6th son. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons." And so she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Now, how about that? Up to this point, we have 10 boys, 10 sons. Do you think that girl's going to be spoiled? Dinah is a very interesting part of biblical history. God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. Then she conceived and bore a son. God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son. God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, "My Lord, add to me another son." Now that is rather remarkable. The rest of this book is all centered around Joseph, but that's all we get about the birth of Joseph. The only thing that is significant is that Dinah and Joseph were born at about the same time. Now, you can do this yourself. I've done it, but there have been a lot of Bible commentators that have done it. Take into mind the fact that Leah already has 6 sons born at different times and a daughter, and those 2 maidservants had 4 people. Take all these births and look at when they took place and find out how long were they actually in Shechem here when this actually happened. According to what we find in Genesis, Joseph and Dinah were born about the same time. I just mentioned that. An estimate of Dinah and Joseph's age at that time of leaving Haran. Now, what does it mean by leaving Haran? That means coming from way up north, going all the way down south. Jacob served 20 years for Laban. At 14 years, he worked for Laban, worked for the two daughters. Dinah was born in the 18th year as we calculate all the kids that were born. This would tell us that Dinah was no more than 3 years old when Jacob fled from Laban to go back to his homeland. Let's take a look at that. Let's go through that very quickly. What we find out is coming all the way from up here, Dinah's maybe 3 years old. We talked about these situations where Jacob wrestled with the angel, where they stopped in Mahanaim for a while. And then we find out that Jacob and his family stayed at Succoth for a little while before he moved off to Shechem. I think I have something here. Here's a map that shows exactly what happened in that regard. And a rather pertinent thing. Then Jacob safely came to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram. That's way up north. And he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money a piece of land on which he built pitched his tent. And there he erected an altar and called it El-Hoam Israel, El-Hoa Israel. He actually bought land. He was planning to stay there. Actually, we have to conclude he must have stayed there quite a while, because let's take a look at this next verse. This is the first verse of chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women in the land. Dinah was 3 years old when they left. Now she's going out to visit the women. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her, he lay with her, and humbled her. In other words, she was a grown woman. A lot of time has passed. The question is just how much. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the maiden and spoke to her tenderly. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Give me this maiden for my wife." We have to conclude that Dinah must have been at least 15. She may have been as old as 20, or maybe even 22 or 23. When we take a look at some of the pictures here, she doesn't look like she's a little girl anymore. Oh, by the way, this is another place where I found a lot of examples of Dinah being kidnapped. Here she's being kidnapped. Here's an older print. Again, she's being kidnapped, and there she's not a 15-year-old girl. And this is another one of those pictures. Why that picture was always included, I don't know. Since she was old enough to be considered for marriage, she may well have been 15 or 16, or even a bit older. We don't really know how much. This means that Jacob and his family lived in Shechem vicinity for at least 12 years. It may have been as many as 15 years, or maybe even longer. This would allow for a year or so in Succoth before they moved to Shechem. This would also mean that the sons, the 11 of them, grew up in the area around Shechem. This becomes pertinent in chapter 37. We think of these as just kids that are coming from Haran, and now they're living in Shechem. But if we're going to have 10 or 15 years, they're going to grow up. If Reuben was about 12 or 13 at that time, add 15 years to that, he's in his late 20s. It could very well have been in his early 30s. In other words, we're not dealing with children anymore. We're dealing with some grown-ups. Dinah is a grown-up, and so are the brothers. This is what I had just said. Now Jacob had heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah. He's talking about Shechem. Shechem was the name of the prince. It was also the name of the city, by the way. But his sons were with cattle in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went to Jacob to speak to him. The sons of Jacob came in from the field, and when they heard of it, the men were very indignant and very angry. because he had wrought folly in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing not ought to be done. This is the only picture I could find of Hamor approaching Jacob. Say, look, can't we do something about this situation? My boy would like to marry your daughter. Apparently, the sons don't feel quite that way. But Hamor spoke, saying, say to the soul of my son, Shechem longs for your daughter. I pray that you give her to him. Make marriage with us, and give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. Then we shall dwell with us. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, get property in it. Looks like a great idea. But Shechem also said to her father, Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you say to me, I will give. In other words, now Shechem goes and pleads both to the father, that's Hamor, and to Shechem. He said, can't we work this out? Find favor with me. Whatever you say, I will give. Ask of me whatever so much as marriage present and gift, and I will give according to as you say to me. And give me the maiden to be my wife. The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled Dinah. In other words, Shechem is coming, trying to be friendly. What can we do to work this all out? But those boys were still rather incensed. They said to him, you cannot do this thing. We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised. For that you would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we consent to you, that you will become as we are, and every male of you be circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us, and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. Now, that is quite a price to be asked. The words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem, and the young men did not delay to do a thing, because they had delight in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of the family. So Hamor and his son came to the gate of their city and spoke to the many men, saying, these men are friendly to us. Let us dwell in the land and trade with them. And behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters into marriage and give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us and to become one people, that every male be circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their cattle, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Not only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us. And all went out of the gate of the city, hearkened to Hamor, and to his son Shechem. And every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. I found pictures of the circumcision of these males. There's one. Oops. Here's a different picture. Here's a really old one. It shows every male being circumcised. On the third day, when they were sore, and two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came upon the city unawares and killed all the males. They slew Hamor and his son with a sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. Here we have pictures of what happened. We see them taking Dinah away, and again, Dinah's being taken away. Now we see pictures where, I like this picture, and especially you notice all the women are together, but all the men have been slain. In other words, when they were still sore from having undergone this particular operation, that's when Levi and Simeon said, this is a good time to attack them. That was probably good thinking, in a way. Here's another picture. And the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because their sister had been defiled. And they took their flocks and their herds and their asses and whatever was in the city and in the field, and all their wealth, and all the little ones and their wives, and all that was in the houses. They captured them and made their prey. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me odious to the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should he treat our sister as a harlot?" Now this was a very interesting verse to me for another reason, is that I was familiar with this verse from something I had learned many, many years ago. This same verse, let me get them. The same verse is in the King James Version. The King James Version says, "And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me to make me stink among the inhabitants of the land, and among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed." You notice I have made bold one word here, and that's the word stink. I have run into this before, and that is that in the New Standard Revised Version that I use most of the time here, a lot of the language has been modified to make it a little calmer than it was originally. In some of the commentaries I read that the original word in Hebrew we do not have an English translation for. I'd like to know what that word was, because it must have indicated something that was rather significant. But when you hear that word stink, how do you react? When was the King James Version written? That was written in the 1500s. And apparently that word stink had a different connotation. It really meant something odious, something bad. And what the original Hebrew word was, I don't know. But the thing that I always remember, and I hesitate in telling this story because I think I told it to this class once before, and that is that Samuel Johnson, the famous British author, among the things that he wrote was a book called A Dictionary of the English Language. And he was a stickler about words, that they be understood just exactly what they meant, and they should be used only in the correct way and not the wrong way. They tell a story about Samuel Johnson, who was not in the habit of bathing regularly. He sometimes could be offensive, not only in appearance and just being around them. That one day he was in some social gathering, and a very fashionable woman sat down next to him, and she pointed at him and said, "Dr. Johnson, you smell." Johnson turned around to her and pointed at her and says, "No, you smell, I stink." Now, he was using that word. The word had some connotation that was really rather significant. But by the time we get to our translation, we're just given the word odious. But you notice that chapter stops right at that point. It doesn't say anything more about it. Actually, what we find out is that we go on a little bit further, things change rather rapidly as far as the Israelites being there in the environments of Shechem, is that they leave. Now, we're told they left for a different reason. We'll look at that in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to point out something else, and that is that if we go all the way to chapter 49, chapter 49, that's the end of the book of Genesis, we get what is referred to as Jacob's oracle. Now, what is an oracle? An oracle is supposed to be a situation where somebody foretells what is happening in the future. And what we're told is that Jacob got his sons together, and then Jacob called his sons, "Gather yourselves together, and I will tell you what shall befall you in the days to come. Assemble and hear, O sons of Jacob, and hearken to your father. Here's one picture. This is a better picture of Jacob and his son. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Now, this oracle was written many, many years after Jacob had made these statements. As a matter of fact, it probably even was modified by the priestly writer. And is sometimes the case, you will find oracles not only in the Bible but other places where people will make predictions about certain events after the facts. In other words, they know what has already happened and say, now I'm going to foretell this is what's going to happen next. And this is what happens here in a very interesting fashion. Because in this oracle, what he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, weapons of violence and their swords. They were the two brothers that started this attack on all these people when they were still sore from this circumcision. He says, O my soul, come not into their counsel. O my spirit, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they slay men, and in their wantonness they hamstrung oxen. Then be cursed in their anger, for it is fierce, and in their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now that's what it says in Genesis 49. We go through the rest of that chapter, we find out most of it is the oracle in which Jacob is telling these sons where they're going to live. Now, how does he know that? Because he's telling them long after, well, he's telling something that he already knew the answer to. He already knew the answer to the situation of Simeon and Levi. And what does he say? I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. In other words, you're not going to be able to find out where Simeon and Levi are. They're going to be divided in the whole country. Let's take a look at what actually happened. In the Bible, you find out, go to the maps of Israel, there is no place that is called Levi or the Levi country. The Levites were given no land whatsoever, but they were assigned cities. I think there was, 48 different cities were called Levitical cities. These were cities, and I think I got a map of this here. These were cities that were scattered throughout Israel. Here are the 48 locations. In other words, any Levite could go to those cities and be expected to be treated well. But he could not own land there. He could just be treated well. But he would not own land. Here are some of the cities. Some of the most famous cities that we have in Israel actually were Levitical cities. This is not all of them, but here are Shechem is one of them. Shechem was one of them here. Kalish is one. Anathoth is a city that we're going to talk quite a bit about later on. And a lot of these are other, there's another city that's familiar that Samuel stopped at. These were cities that any Levite could go to. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, because by the time you get to the New Testament, you don't hear very much about the children of Zebulun or the children of Issachar or even of Dan. But you do hear about Levites. Who were the Levites? Well, the Levites were all descendants of they're all descendants of Levi, and they are people that have grown up in these Levitical states. But there was more to it than that. When we get to the story a bit further, we find out that the Levites, or the people that were from the tribe of Levi, were going to be very much concerned with the religious matters of the people. One of the things that the Levites had to do was to take care of the temple and maintain the temple. Another one is that they were the ones that formed the choirs. Another one that was rather significant is that only if you were a Levite could you become a priest. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. There were a lot of Levites who were not qualified to be priests. This becomes very pertinent later on in the Old Testament, the difference between the Levites and the priesthood in that regard. But it's kind of interesting, the Levites, or the descendants of Levi, we're told that you will not have a place like Zebulun did and Issachar did and Dan did and Judah did. They all had locations in Israel that they could say, this is ours. Levi would not be the case. Now, what about Simeon? Simeon is equally interesting. This is the inheritance of Simeon. We find out what that inheritance is from Joshua 19. The second lot came out for Simeon, for the tribe of Simeon, according to its families and its inheritance, was in the midst of the inheritance of the tribe of Judah. Now, I did not make this big enough, but these are the names of all of the cities that were in Judah that were assigned to the Simeon as part of their heritage. The inheritance of the tribe of Simeon formed part of the territory of Judah because the portion of the tribe of Judah was too large for them, and the tribe of Simeon obtained inheritance in the midst of their inheritance. If we take any look at any map, we constantly see the same thing. Here are all the 12 tribes, but you notice the tribe of Simeon right in the middle of Judah. And apparently what had happened, it was only a matter of a short time, because when we read a bit further, we find that there's more to consider here. And that is that although in the Joshua 19, you get that list of cities that were assigned to Simeon, later on in Joshua, or other place in Joshua, I should say, we find those same cities are assigned to Judah. In other words, the people in Simeon were what? They were amalgamated, assimilated into Judah, and we no longer have a tribe of Simeon, and we never hear of them again. So in a sense, this oracle of Jacob had a lot of validity in that regard, is that both Levi and his brother Simeon had descendants, but they did not have land that was part of the promised land that had gone to the others. If we get to that chapter 49, and we will sometime in the next few weeks, we'll see how different parts of Israel were assigned to different tribes. How did Jacob know that? Well, he was talking about something that happened many years later, and now saying, oh, I'm foretelling that. But let's go back to what the situation. This is for me. If there's time, I'm going to do a little bit more. If there's time, I'm going to take into consideration what we had just said about the situation pertaining to the life of Jacob and his family in Shechem after this incident with the slaying of all the men that had recently been circumcised. As Jacob says, it's not going to be comfortable for us. It's going to be very easy for anybody to give us more trouble than we really want to ever have. What happens, the way it is written in the book of Genesis, that is when he gets a call from God to go back to Bethel. I think it was very fortuitous he got that call, because that was the time for them to get out of Shechem. This is rather significant that they spent that much time in Shechem. I'm going to just tell you one other thing right now, and we'll get back to it later on. And that is that we are told that something that's significant happened when Joseph was 17. If Joseph was 17, he would have been about the same age as Dinah. He would still have been living in Shechem. But when we get to that part of the book of Genesis, we cannot tell for sure where Joseph was actually living. Just try to remember that I had mentioned that, because this becomes significant when we get to chapter 37. So if there is time, let's take a look at what we got here. And God said to Jacob, "Arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make there an altar to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Now Jacob speaks. So Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, "Put away your foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel, that we may make there an altar to the God who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me ever since I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods they had, and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under an oak that was in Shechem. And I think I have a picture of all of these being put in the ground underneath this oak in Shechem. Let's go back. How important is that? If you're very careful and read, you will find out this is the first time that you get any indication that the Israelites are going to worship only Yahweh and God alone. Up to this time, there's every reason to believe that they were still involved with foreign gods. You remember the story of Jacob and his family when they left? When they left, Rachel had stolen what? The family idols, and hid those family idols. Why did she want them? Well, because she wanted her family to, because apparently even Jacob's family at that time were still involved in worshiping other idols. It is only until we get to this time when they get to Bethel, the second time we're going to Bethel, before they get there, they get rid of all of those idols, and now they become monolaudatory. In other words, they will worship only one God. Go to the Ten Commandments. What does the commandment say? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What does that statement in itself say? There are other gods. Are there other gods? Well, certainly there are other gods. You'll find out even in modern society, there are people who are worshiping a lot of other things other than worshiping the God that we worship. They can worship wealth. They can worship notoriety. They can worship power. There are things that are very easy to worship. And what the commandment says is that there are other gods. But what? Do not ever put those other gods before me. But there were these other gods. What we're finding right now is that before they go to Shechem, before they leave Shechem and go to Bethel, they're to get rid of all these gods, and they're going to worship only one God and not worship these other gods. Why is that so significant? Because they're going into the land of Canaan. And the land of Canaan is the one that has, I think, about 25 or 30 different gods that they worship. They have a God for just about anything you can possibly think of. When you take a look at the history of the Israelites, you find out that an awful lot of the people that claimed later on to be Israelites were people that had probably been living in Canaan for a long time and had been assimilated into the Israelite faith or Israelite religion. They had been worshiping these other gods for a long time. Now they were supposed to worship only one God. What is the one thing that we see occurring over and over again in the Old Testament? That during the reign of certain kings, he did not have the people do what? Put away their other gods or destroy their other gods. There was this constant, you might say, struggle that existed as far as the idea of worshiping only one God, is that in the people's minds they still had all these other gods, and it was hard for them to get rid of those gods. Actually, this is the first time we find that they were instructed to do so. There was no indication at all that Abraham himself and Isaac and Rebekah were not involved with other gods. It doesn't say anything about it. But what we do find is that if you take a look at the picture that we have here, if you take a look at the picture that we have here, they were pretty busy burying all those other gods. There were a lot of gods to be buried. So what we find is a very, very marked change taking place right now as far as what's happening in going to Bethel. But let's go back to this going to Bethel. This is really not the best map in terms of seeing it. It should be clear. But you find out there's a sort of a straight line going from Shechem down through Bethel and going all the way down to Jerusalem and to Hebron. It's sort of it was like a road. I think this shows up a little better in this map. Here is where they came from up north. They came to this side of the Jordan River. They were in Succoth. Then they moved over to Shechem. Now take a look at this line going from Shechem to Bethel, and then to Jerusalem, and to Bethlehem, and then down to Hebron, and eventually to the place where Jacob had actually started out originally, Beersheba. Now, when Jacob was leaving Beersheba, fleeing Esau, he stopped in Bethel. Very quickly, let's remember what happened in Bethel. This is where he had the vision of the angels going up and down the ladder. This is where he had not only the vision, but he also had the promise from God that God would be with him. This was Jacob maybe when he was 25 or 26 years old, just a very young man at that time. He had just done what? He had just, in essence, stolen the birthright of his brother. And his brother is out to kill him. And he is fleeing, going 500 miles away to what kind of a life? And God is promising him in Bethel at that time that God will be with him. Now, what he's given the opportunity to do is to go back to Bethel, to leave Shechem and go back to Bethel. When he was in Shechem as a young man, he set up a pillar. He set up a pillar and said, this is where I'm going to worship. This is the God that I'm worshiping. What is that? Oh, okay. This is also part of 35. As they journeyed, the terror of God fell upon the cities that were around them. In other words, Jacob still had reason to be afraid, but it says that God kept them from attacking him and his family, till they came to Luz, which was a name that was used for Bethel, which was in the land of Canaan. He and all the people were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Well, I want to say a little bit about that name Bethel. Actually, I think I'd like to show this next slide as well. Here is Jacob coming back to Bethel. He's not alone. You notice that he's got the wives and the maids here. It doesn't show any of the children. Also have another picture of where he set up a pillar. He's obviously not a young man anymore. So this is the second time now that Jacob finds himself in Bethel. Now I want to go back to that word Bethel. How many of you know what the word Beth, like in Bethlehem, stands for? It stands for house. Go to a Bible dictionary and you'll find a row after row of different places that were called Beth something or other. House of such and such. Bethel, what do you think that meant? House of God. Now, in this case, this means house of which God? The God that Jacob was worshiping. But actually, Bethel was much older than Jacob himself. There are reasons to believe that Bethel was a center of worship among the Canaanites even before Abraham came on the scene. And they looked at it as being, a place of where you would find the gods. It is only when we get to Jacob that we find that the God they're referring to is the God of Jacob. Bethel, interesting word. I did not know this. There is only one city in the whole of the Old Testament that's mentioned more than Bethel. Can you guess what that is? Jerusalem. But Bethel comes in second. In other words, it was referred to so many times. I can recall in going through different lessons over the years that when there was a question where something may have come from, one of the first places people often said maybe that came from Bethel, because they looked at that as being a rather special city in that regard. So here's Jacob setting up this pillar. I had to look into this. This was interesting. In that chapter 20, this is chapter 24, the one that comes after. This is probably 34. Oh no, this is way back. When Rebecca was taken back to marry Isaac, it says that her nurse came along with her. That nurse apparently had been with them that whole time, but she died when they were on this trip. Let me get to this. This I've covered. And as they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were still some distance from Ephrath, Ephrath is another name for Bethlehem, Rachel travailed as she had a hard labor. And when she was in hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Fear not, for now you will have another son." And her soul was departing, for she died. And she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. Now here again, something very strange. Would Joseph have known about Benjamin? You're going to find out that Joseph left Shechem when he was about 17, many years before they went to Bethel. He may never have known that he had a brother named Benjamin. We'll run into that later on when we get the story of Joseph when he is in Egypt. But we find out that Rachel dies, the beloved of Rachel, So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephraim. That's Ephrath. That's Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar upon her grave. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. There's Rachel dying. And guess what? It is there. Now, that's a picture that's taken a few decades ago. But there's a picture today. It's still one of the most visited places in Israel by tourists to come to visit the tomb of Rachel. Oh, I'm going backwards now. And that may have been the pillar that was set up at that time. It's in that vicinity, and I'm sure that the tourist guys say there's the pillar, but whether that is the pillar or not is a question. Jacob set up the pillar. Then Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Elder. And while Israel dwelt in that land of ruin, let me leave that out. When Jacob had got into Bethel, we read, verse 9, God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So his name was Israel. Didn't we have that story before? Actually, this is the third time that we find Jacob is being blessed by God and told that he will multiply and increase. The first time was when he was in Bethel and saw the angels going up and down the stairs. And he was told, "Yes, we may not know what your future is right now, but I can tell you, you will have a nation. You will be blessed." Jacob was, 25 years old. Remember the other time, we also found that Jacob had a vision when he was wrestling with the angel. And remember what the angel told him? Your name is no longer Jacob, your name is Israel. And again, was given the blessing a second time. Now, here is the third time that we find this blessing. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to how that came about? Well, actually from three different sources. The first source, the one where we have Jacob in Bethel for the first time and seeing the angels going up and down the stairs, was probably from the Yahwist. That probably came from the Yahwist. The one where Jacob is wrestling with the angel was very typical of the sort of thing that the Elohist would have written. The Elohist was another one of the sources that often would talk about angels. And then all of a sudden, we get to this third time, and this was the priestly source. I'll tell you a little bit about the priestly source. Most of the priestly source was written after the sources Yahwist and Yellowist were written. Very likely, the priestly writers used what was in the Elohist and the Yahwist to put the priestly source together, but did the best they could to leave out the stories until just the things that were pertinent. And one of the things that felt was very pertinent was this section in which we find that, yes, this priestly source is now telling us something that is significant, and that again, things will work well for you, Jacob. Now I'm going to skip a couple sides here. I want to show you something that pertains to what I have just said. You will not find this in your Bible. I did this. I took that whole chapter of 35 and I broke the thing up. I broke the thing up into Elohist part. This Elohist part is this part where Jacob leaves Shechem. Now, it's not surprising that that is Elohist, because the Elohist wrote a lot about the things that happened in the north, that happened in Shechem. Then all of a sudden we get black. That's priestly. That's the priestly source. Then we get the Elohist source, and then we get the priestly source. But what's this? That's a little bit of the Yahwist source. Just a little bit of the, and just that one verse, and that's all that shows up in that one verse. And it's a Yahwist verse. Well, I'll have to tell you what it is. I don't have this. What it says in that Yahwist verse is that right after Rachel died, Reuben, the eldest son of Jacob, the eldest son of Leo, went and had sexual intercourse with Bilhah, who was the maid of Rachel. And this he shouldn't have done. And that is all that is said here. In other words, what we find is that Reuben does something that's, for some reason, when the redactor that was putting this together said, I'm going to put that one verse in here, indicating that Reuben had done something about the time that Rachel died. What had he done? According to the way it is written, he apparently had sexual intercourse with Bilhah, who was the maid of Rachel. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more about what may have actually have happened. One thing you do want to keep in mind, however, is this. Reuben was the eldest of the sons. He does not end up the leader. Simeon and Levi were the next. They do not end up the leader. Who is the one person that is left that ends up as the great leader of the Israelites? Judah, who was born fourth. And next week we're going to take a little bit of a look at the things that led up to the situation that put Reuben in a situation that we find that he is a minor tribe of little importance and on the other side of the Jordan River. And we'll do that next week, the end.